Hello to my friends, family in America, India, and abroad. This is India Insight with Sunny Sharma and Sunny Sharma at India Insight Movement, my YouTube channel. Today, I wanted to do a YouTube and video podcast discussing a pertinent issue to this year because the November midterm elections are coming up, and there are many uh, important politicians and legislators who are up for reelection. One of them is the senator in Georgia who's the senator of my state and district and area is Senator Jon Ossoff. And I really want to lay the case for why we have to support people like Senator Jon Ossoff. So I've titled my report on this Senator Jon Ossoff, Georgia's working man's champion who will protect voting rights. So here is what I'll get started with saying. Senator Jon Ossoff wasn't well known until him and the pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church of Atlanta, the same church that Dr. King headed, Reverend Raphael Warnock, took center stage in the two Senate races in Georgia, defeating Republican challengers in 2021 and cementing Georgia as a battleground state for posterity. Today, Georgia, which used to be a deep Republican red state, is now deeply contested between both major political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. Who would have thought that two of the highest political seats in Georgia would be occupied by the youngest person to enter the Senate in decades of Jewish descent, and a black preacher who is the youngest of 12 siblings from impoverished public housing in Savannah, Georgia, who inherited Dr. King's historical role as a prophetic voice? In a time when progressive value assessment is continually being questioned, these two men have maintained a position that has allowed them to work across the aisle and pass sweeping legislation on behalf of many Georgians and American citizens, especially the downtrodden. For this reason, the working man's champion, Senator Jon Ossoff's Senate seat, is being significantly challenged by the Republican Party, and he will not be the last. But before we talk about why this is happening, we must introduce who is Senator Jon Ossoff. Senator Jon Ossoff got his master's in political economy degree from the London School of Economics, and he used this degree to create an international film media company called Insight that reveals and documents corruption in places around the world. If you ask any serious leader, many great organizers were journalists first, whether that was their end of term paper from college or the proclivity in the current era to utilize social media to highlight the injustices and inequities in our society, whether they are political problems, historical precedent, or social attitudes. Ossoff's company took such investigation into global despotism one step further, highlighting some of the most egregious injustices in similar manner to many of the independent journalism done today, like news conducted by the company Democracy Now! However, as a political candidate and organizer, he did lose his first political race in the 2017 special election for Georgia's 6th congressional district. He took the lessons from that political race and an urgent sentiment fueled by opposition to the Republican Party's efforts to delegitimize the 2020 legal and properly run presidential election, to win a successful run for U.S. Senate in 2021, along with Reverend Raphael Warnock, who won the other Senate seat. Although I only canvassed for Senator Jon Ossoff once, Senator Ossoff's U.S. Senate race was the first time I was ever involved in a political campaign, and there is a good reason for that. It was Senator Ossoff who inspired millions through his rhetoric, including many people who volunteered for his campaign, that even included many students who went to my high school, as his office was based very close to where I live in Dunwoody, Georgia. His 2020-2021 political platform in his run for Senate not only prioritized economic justice through a strengthening of the Affordable Care Act, ACA, including expanding Medicaid and capping prescription drug costs, he also focused on clean energy development, repairing infrastructure across the state, ending private prisons, banning lobbying by former members of Congress so as to limit the power of corporations, and even increasing protections for immigrants while supporting a pathway for citizenship for undocumented immigrants, especially young dreamers. However, the two most unprecedented reforms he supported, particularly in hindsight of current problems, was one, helping military families and veterans by providing better VA mental health services and privatized housing to prevent homelessness, and second, supporting the voting rights legacy of the civil rights leader he interned for when he was a student, John Lewis. Today, the fight for the implementation of both programs to end homelessness and in support of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act continue, and Ossoff has certainly delivered during his time in office. Senator Jon Ossoff's race to secure his seat for U.S. Senate is not just important because most likely it will be the most expensive U.S. Senate race in American history. It is important for Americans if they are to prioritize a fight for a better future. Much of Ossoff's platform is very reminiscent of President Barack Obama's run for office. This is not a coincidence. It is clear that Ossoff is one of the hardest working legislators, leaders, and public servants in Congress. By passing more standalone bills than any other freshman senator in his first 2 years in office, he has prioritized public safety through the investigation of civil rights murders, has strengthened mental health services for veterans, has attracted thousands of advanced manufacturing jobs and billions of dollars of investments to Georgia, through the historic bipartisan infrastructure law, delivering an unprecedented expansion of broadband internet access, upgrading ports, airports, roads, bridges, and water infrastructure statewide, and investing in the resilience of Georgia's coast to help local communities prepare for storm surge, coastal flooding, and tropical storms. His economic, prison reform, and infrastructure legislative victories are impressive in themselves, but more than that, his focus on helping veteran families by enhancing VA healthcare and his fight to protect vulnerable children and women from trafficking and foster care abuse reflects his deeply held values as a political representative and leader. Public safety and helping our most marginalized citizens have been cornerstones of his philosophy, and it all goes back to his mentorship under one of the most important civil rights icons of the past generation, John Lewis. Mentored by civil rights legend Congressman John Lewis, Senator Ossoff previously led a small business called Insight that produced investigative journalism exposing war crimes, public corruption, human trafficking, and organized crime. Following his mentor's legacy, Senator Ossoff is one of the biggest proponents of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which requires states to get permission from the Department of Justice or D.C. federal court before changing voting laws, especially geared towards southern states with a history of voting discrimination. We need voting rights champions like Jon Ossoff in the Senate to counter a Supreme Court which in the last 13 years have passed two decisions which foundationally made the 1965 voting rights legislation completely useless. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act was proposed directly in response to the 5-4 Supreme Court decision Shelby County v. Holder 2013 that gutted Section 5 preclearance, the very same provision that requires jurisdictions with histories of discrimination to obtain federal approval before changing voter laws. More recently, on April 29, 2026, the Supreme Court 6-3 decision Louisiana v. Calais 2026 gutted Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, whereby the court established African American minority groups, drawing congressional maps in proportion to their population, is unconstitutional racial gerrymandering. Specifically, the court held state maps can only be changed if intentional racial discrimination is shown, but confusingly, the majority opinion also held race shall no longer be considered when proposing new map electoral configurations. However, it is not just the judicial branch of government that is working to undermine the American democratic constituent base. The systematic attack on voting rights legislation leading up to the 2026 midterms at the end of this year has made Senator Ossoff particularly focus on inspiring Georgians to defeat the narrative of an overbearing conservative federal government. The only way to flip the House in favor of Democrats is for people across America to vote for progressives like Senator Jon Ossoff. Here is just a little of what John has said during his political campaign this year. At a church speech on February 17, 2026, Ossoff proclaimed the power of the people to shape government in their image against the power of the overbearing presidency of Donald Trump, who is still trying to impress upon his voter base that the 2020 election was stolen. Trump has, quote, sent agents to Fulton County, Georgia to seize your ballots on a pack of lies so as to use state power to rewrite history. The president is personally managing federal raids on election sites in battleground states to delegitimize your exercise of power. Trump is launching an attack on voting rights in the political and spiritual center of the Black history they're trying to erase. The power of the presidency is nothing compared to the power of the people, end quote. Just like the Supreme Court's attack on voting rights, the executive in chief is also working to undermine the power of Democratic voters, especially in the South, which is not only the cradle of the civil rights movement, it has the greatest proportion of Black political allegiance to the Democratic Party. That February speech, by no coincidence, highlighted the challenges of voting at a Black church to emphasize America's history of voting discrimination. However, Senator Jon Ossoff's political message spoke more broadly about economic justice for all people. Here is a reference to corruption and the inequality it produces in American society from another speech. This is why things don't work for ordinary people. Quote, drug companies spend millions on political campaigns to protect their profits. This fight isn't just about politics, one man, or even a party. It's about power. Who has it and who our system serves. If we can break the grip of corruption, our politics can meet the people's needs and not just serving the rich and powerful. Senator Ossoff, in another speech, highlights that we must pick leaders who reflect our value system by highlighting the legacy of a champion for human rights, Marian Wright, on March 17, 2026, while on the campaign trail. Quote, the Georgia state economy is 40 times larger than the economy of civil war-ridden countries like Lebanon, yet if you are born in Georgia, your life expectancy is lower. We don't have a money problem, we have a profound value and priorities problem. All this needless death, suffering, and misery is a choice. Georgian leaders have decided to leave their constituents without health insurance or hospitals. These are undeniable facts. We must put into question whether they are serious and competent people. They don't just defund healthcare. Leaders shut down the Maternal Mortality Review Board so the state can't investigate deaths in childbirth. He reiterates, American activist for civil rights and children's rights, Marian Wright's above phrase. She is the founder of the Children's Defense Fund and inspired Dr. King and Hillary Clinton. She was the first woman invited to the Mississippi bar as a lawyer and testified to the Senate in Washington on child hunger. Quote, go and look at the empty cupboards in the Delta. This quote resulted in the Senate holding a hearing in Jackson, Mississippi, where Robert F. Kennedy came. Wright refused to let power look away from suffering, end quote. Ossoff concludes the speech with a trademark declaration he frequently reiterates. If they don't care, we will elect leaders who do. The power of the people is much greater than all the power under the Golden Dome. In another 2026 speech, he describes, what would the founders think? If they were alive today, Senator Ossoff expressed they would be surprised at how many challenges American society has overcome, from defeating fascism to ending slavery to raising standards of living, even when everything looked hopeless. But they would be appalled at the levels of America's faults. America is still the greatest hope, yet we fall behind in many metrics compared to other developed nations, from childcare to maternal mortality. We can't get rid of corruption without electing the right leaders in the midterms. Yet again, Ossoff reiterates how our leaders reflect our values, and that is why Americans can shape government to match our aspirations. In another speech this year, Donald Trump himself is a symptom of deeper disease. Senator Ossoff draws parallels with the revelations of corruption he unearthed through his investigative journalism company, Insight, and how he sees the same signs of decay in American society today. I work with people who smuggle the truth out of authoritarian governments, opposition, TV hosts, dissidents, etc., by leading a film company called Insight. Our society is starting to reflect tyranny. Senator Ossoff has clearly shown a capacity to empathize with the marginalized, uplift unheard voices, and champion American working capacity, both for people in their roles as laborers and as citizens. There are few legislators, leaders, and political messengers like him. There is a particular piece of journalism from the New Republic that highlights just how Senator Ossoff has played such a central role in American political life. What suddenly made Jon Ossoff into such a Democratic rock star? Perry Bacon, May 6, 2026, The New Republic. The writer Bacon emphasizes that Ossoff has taken a unique approach to politics, whereby he has paid more attention to the needs of his state rather than maintaining an exalted presence in national news. It is undoubtable that he has national acclaim, but he has used this acclaim to work for the betterment of Georgians and marginalized people all over America. He's worked in bipartisan efforts with the Republicans to highlight substandard military housing in Congress, but has taken a much broader stance against elitism that seeks to benefit the rich against the interests of working class Americans. This involves advocating against federal cuts to Medicaid, high grocery and gas prices, and the war in Iran. Bacon emphasizes Ossoff's unique approach is not only his focus on wealth gap and affordability, but especially his emphasis on his trademark program against American and global corruption. There are leaders like him across America who are not just concerned with capital and labor, but also how these elements relate to the preservation of the American democratic experiment and self-government. We need to elect leaders like them in the coming November midterms or be prone to a more permanent despotism. Thank you for listening to my podcast, and I hope this podcast has informed you a little bit about Senator Jon Ossoff, who was elected in 2021, along with Reverend Raphael Warnock. And what I really wanted to emphasize in this podcast is that there has been efforts by both the judicial branch as well as the executive branch to reform the voting legislation of our government to make voting to make it harder for minority representation to gain power in government. And this will deeply affect the South. And if the executive and judicial branch are doing this, we need more people in the legislative branch who will fight against such measures. So I thank you for listening, and I'll be back with another podcast in the future. Thank you.